parking tickets and leave me alone. Stick to something you know about.
Listen, my daughter was about your age. Then she met a guy like you. Now she's dead.
You should believe in ghosts, P-Brain.
He's a closet.
Don't hurt me, please. Don't keep me waiting for those onions, Herman.
This is all the whiskey you possess?
Everyone out of the way of the bulldozer!
Hello and welcome to Hello, This is the Doomed Show. I am Richard. Folks, or people, I am joined by Jeffrey. Hello, Jeffrey.
Hello, Richard.
Oh, he's got his literature voice on. I like it.
Yes.
Doing something different today, or tonight, or this morning on the show. We're talking about horror fiction, because you and I, we've never really talked about it on air, and it was only very recently that we actually talked about horror fiction off air, which is not on a podcast. That's different. That's the
it's
other
in the
talking.
air still.
Yeah.
Like, that's how sound works.
Ew. I believe that you like horror literature and horror fiction.
I like it a little bit.
Good. Because I don't want to be in trouble. Recently, I got back into reading horror fiction. I did as a kid, and maybe at the end of this wonderful picking your brain, I'll run through like the 5 things I've read. We'll save my experiences for the end. But Paperbacks from Hell, that book by Grady Hendrix, was something that... Is there 2 authors? Does it have more than one author?
There is, yes. See, real heads know that if you're a fan of the Paperbacks from Hell genre, there's a blog, a very important blog.
Yes.
Called Too Much Horror Fiction, run by the co-author Will Erickson.
Oh, that's the other guy. Okay, so Will Erickson and Grady Hendrix.
Yes.
That blog is amazing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've learned of so many wonderful things throughout the years from that blog. It's a invaluable even resource for those who like the night bumpy reads.
So those 2 things combined reignited my interest in reading horror fiction, and that is where I will stop talking, because I am here to extricate all of the Jeffy bits from your brain. The Jeffy bits?
They're very spongy bits.
Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to since I can't prove that you're real. Mm-hmm. Even if I met you in person, you're still outside of my consciousness. So I literally don't know if you're a real person or not.
Yeah, when you blink, I disappear.
That's actually so scary. I'm so sorry. I will never blink again. Yeah. But let's talk about your earliest memories of reading horror fiction. What were your close encounters of the first kind?
Right, so very coincidentally and fortuitously, my earliest childhood reading memories are all tied into horror fiction.
Yes!
Because that's pretty much all that I read as a kid. It's all I was watching, too. And so when you combine these 2 things together, I think that explains a lot about me as an individual. So I wanted to run through some of the ones that I liked most as a kid and have either the most specific all right, let's put it like this. All of these memories are very, very specific and vivid, and yet some of them I can remember the texts very well, and others I don't remember at all, other than the covers, right. Which if you are a fan of horror fiction, you know that approximately 60% of their appeal and your enjoyment of them is the wonderful cover art. Reading them is, only about 40%. So this is my childhood memories are a little bit of a blend of the 2. So some of the ones that I have the most poignant memories of actually reading, and that I still read now. I mean, I still read all of these now. But first big one, which I'm sure you're familiar with as well, are the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark trilogy. by Elvin Schwartz, the renowned folklorist, with the beautiful and totally grisly illustrations by Stephen Gammell.
Oh, yes.
So you like these, right? You've read them?
I've read, I want to say, the third one, and that's it. I had never seen these as a kid, but I was very curious about them and was able to check out the third one from my library. So it was way different than I was expecting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. They're, I mean, they were on the banned books list for most of my childhood. The first, I can't remember when the first one came out. The first one definitely came out before I was born. And it sort of picked up steam and then never really fell off. And it's still a bestseller, They did for a while get rid of the Gammell illustrations and got another person to do the illustrations. And everybody was like, this is bullshit. Put them back. Put it back. So the first one came out in 1981. And then the second volume, 1984. And then the third volume in 1991. So I think probably around 1991 when the third one was released, it was like a, big build up for it. And I got all of those books. Very important to me, not only because I read them all the time. In fact, my original edition of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, the first volume, which I still own, has on the very last page with the last story, which is the Ghost with the Bloody Fingers story. It still has a Band-Aid that I put on the illustration of the Ghost with Bloody Fingers. It's still there.
Wait, you were trying to help him to stop bleeding, or it freaked you out and you wanted to cover his face?
I was just trying to help him out.
Oh, that's so cute.
Yeah. But the important thing about these is that they're pretty, well, interactive is maybe the wrong word, but they're very much structured as almost like pieces of folklore or activities, like storytelling activities that you could do in person, because that's how a lot of these folk tales were originally told. So by we I mean my mother and I, and really my mother, made a birthday party for me when I was quite young, that was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark themed. And we did readings and activities based on all of the stories and poems and songs. That was a very memorable birthday party for me. So Scary Stories Tell in the Dark, essential. And the movie version from a couple years ago is good too.
Oh yeah, I like that one.
Yeah, it does I think a pretty nice job of adapting some of the tales.
Hey, you got the famous moment from the books where the kids fishing poops out of the toilet.
That is my favorite story. The Poop Fisher. I come to fish your poops. Second, very important for anyone my age, would of course be the Goosebumps books by one R.L. Stine.
Nice.
I wasn't much of a reader before the Goosebumps books came into my life. Not that I was I couldn't read or was a bad, I was just totally uninterested in reading, in, first, second grade. And then picked up the Goosebumps books, and then it was a religious experience. And I bought every one, had the full set all through, I think, the early days of the follow-up series, Goosebumps 2000. They're, reading them now, they're very goofy. There's still some that I think have a little bit of an appeal. I love them all, unabashedly, even the ones that are just, total farts. But there are some really good ones that I would stand by today. Some of my most vivid memories, You Can't Scare Me About the Mud Monsters is a really good one, fairly early in the series. There's The Barking Ghost, which has a totally ludicrous ending where a boy turns into a squirrel and is kind of stuck that way forever. But it's got a really great cover art that just stuck with me forever. The Headless Ghost is a great one. Calling All Creeps has this extremely, call it a totally pessimistic and ultimately depressing ending. about giving into peer pressure from a bunch of shape-shifting lizard people.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's a good one. I like that one a lot. Have you ever read any Goosebumps books?
No, I was too old for them when they. I mean, that was God. When was I working at the bookstore? I was working at Walden Books, and I want to say 96, and they were hot.
Oh yeah,
they were freaking huge. We had an entire like kiosk or whatever dedicated just to Goosebumps. And these kids would come in and buy, 14 or 15 of them.
Oh, sure.
And it was just crazy. And I always had to ask their parents, do you guys have a preferred reader card? It's a great program. You'll save 20% on this purchase. If you spend over $100, then you get $20 back. Also, it's only $10 a month. And it really pays for itself, Jeffrey.
Wow, $10 a month is a hard sell.
In the 90s, it was a nightmare.
I mean, even like the Barnes & Noble member thing is like $20 a year, $10 a month.
That's why Walden Books is out of business.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I purchased many a Goosebump at a Walden Books.
Oh, you should have shoplifted them. Jesus. I would have supported you. I never have ever reported a shoplifter. In all of my retail experience, I would just nod and smile as I knew they were stealing. Didn't care.
Tip of the hat.
Yep.
Some other important ones from my childhood. There was sort of he was a little bit more, well, no, actually, I think he covers a lot of the same ground that, Stein did over his career, but he was sort of a hometown hero from the Syracuse region, Bruce Coville. He had a number of works that fell into spooky stuff. He also did a lot of science fiction stuff that was kind of spooky too, and some fantasy as well. But one that really stuck with me because it had some local interest for people in the Syracuse region is one called The Ghost in the Third Row, which is a great middle grade novel. I read it again just a couple of years ago, and it held up. I mean, it's a kid's book, but it was a very entertaining one. That's sort of a ghostly mystery that's inspired by this beautiful theater. It used to be an actual movie theater, and I think they still show movies there every once in a while. But it was transitioned into like a theatrical theater in Syracuse called the Landmark. And it's absolutely gorgeous. I urge you and listeners to Google image search it so you can see this beautiful place. And you take one look at it and you're like, yeah, it's haunted. So it's got this this legend, which we even went on, field trips when I was in grade school to this Landmark Theater, and they would like tell you the legends of the ghost there. It was the ghost of an actress who fell from the balcony and died and haunts the place still. So this mystery about this precocious sort of mystery tween who goes there and helps the spirit move on was a really memorable and enjoyable book from this time period for me. And then I have some that I didn't really read back then, but were very important for other reasons. Mostly, again, those just like holding them and looking at them and maybe like reading the first chapter or so, not having any very clear memories about them, although I've revisited them since and they're quite fun. So I've gotten very into the teen horror books of that period as an adult.
Right.
But back then I didn't really read many of them. There was this one, though, that has an extremely striking cover called The Principal by M.C. Sumner. The Principal is about a principal who is a vampire, and he's like killing kids in the school. And it has a great cover of a hand popping out of a principal's office door, like a vampire hand, just going right through the glass of the principal office door. This was a book that was purchased for my older brother and read to him after an accident. And it really stuck in my memory, just like hiding around a corner, listening to a little bit of the book being read and being like, ooh, that sounds scary.
Wow.
And yeah, it's not really, but it's a fun book for sure. The last one that sort of fits into this this genre of like striking texts that I didn't necessarily read back then are the and I've told you about these, and I think you're aware of them too, the Halloween YA novels.
Yes.
By, I believe, Kelly O'Rourke is the name of the author on those. In the 90s, I wonder around what was there must have been a movie that was out at that point, because I'm wondering why they would have published these. Usually it's to tie into one of the films that's coming out. 97, is that around the time of Curse of Michael Myers? When's that one? Around the same time.
Roundabouts.
Yeah, roundabouts. So a couple years after The Curse of Michael Myers, they release a few YA teen horror novels featuring Michael Myers. The cover art for these is wonderful. I picked these up. They're hot collector's items now. They go for, at the least, like $150 online if you're trying to find them. There's a lot, if you look around, there's a lot of teen horror novels. There's some teen horror novels from Freddy that tied into New Nightmare. Yep. There's some Crystal Lake books with Jason. There's a bunch of different ones. They're all extremely hard to find, and these are some of the hardest to find. I have them all in mint condition because I bought them from the supermarket back in 97 and just stared at them. And again, definitely read some chapters, but never really dug too deep into them. I've again since revisited them, and they're pretty fun as far as these things go.
Yeah, I've managed to read through interlibrary loan. I was able to get loans of 2 of the Freddy ones and 1 of the Jason ones. And one of the Freddy ones was so good that I was like, why didn't they make this into a movie? This would have been perfect. So perfect. It felt like just like something nice to wedge in between like 3 and 4, or between 3 and 5. It was definitely a solid enough book to fit in that era of the Freddy franchise. And the one about Jason was terrible. It was okay. I mean, it was obviously fun to read. Definitely not a waste of time, but man, it was like, I was like, this doesn't work for anything. It was the Jason's spirit possessing people. The nerd of the book finds Jason's mask and becomes Jason by putting it on, and he goes from being like a 95-pound weakling to a 250-pound 7-foot hulking Jason. So
that's how it happens.
Yep, not so hot.
There's also a whole series of Jason X books, if you didn't know.
Really?
There's a whole series. There's multiple Jason X books that are like sequels, I guess, to
What?
Jason X. So yeah, if you want more of that content, it's out there.
I'm not sure.
So that wraps up my childhood horrors. All the stuff that shaped me.
Nice. And what a shape you have.
Shapely.
Yeah. I can see. Even though your video's off, I can tell. So what about classic literature? Like, in the vein of Martin Shelley's Frankenman, the Prometheus paradox. No, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and of course Bram Stoker's Dracula. Like, what's some of the real highbrow horror classics that you enjoy?
Yeah, so I actually put Dracula and Frankenstein on my list first.
Of course.
Largely because I actually feel like most people don't read them. Most people actually just watch the movies and are like, or you just like see a Halloween mask and say, I got it. I got them. They're good.
I'm guilty.
I know what they are. The books are really interesting. I think they're both pretty interesting. Frankenstein, I think, is the better. Well, Frankenstein is the more interesting and complex and thought-provoking of the two. Dracula is just kind of like a rip-roaring good time. It's definitely got its own points of interest to it, but you have to dig a little bit deeper. It's not quite there on the surface, or necessarily like intended. But yeah, both of them are totally wonderful novels, largely different from 98% of the adaptations or uses of the characters that you'll find on screen. And it's actually really fun, once you've read them, to then go watch the hundreds and hundreds of adaptations of them and see the ways, sometimes quite good and sometimes quite bad, that they have been played around with.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely recommend them. I think that if you haven't read them and you like horror, what are you doing? Go read them.
What am I doing? No, I've read Frankenstein, but I have never sat down with good old Dracula because I am not big on the epistolary. Is that the right word? Epistolary?
Yeah.
The novels of letters. Those just get on my nerves. So I've also never read. Is it Jekyll and Hyde? That's also told in letters. Yeah. I gotta get over that. Yes, I will read them. I have that. Every horror fan walks into Barnes and Noble and goes, "Man, I need that fancy faux leather cover."
Faux leather, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cover of Dracula. Better bring that home and read it someday.
Dracula is more of like a documentary type, like scrapbook type storytelling. So it's not all letters, although there are a lot of letters. There's lots of diary entries, newspaper clippings, stuff like that mixed in. So it's a slightly more varied take on the epistolary novel. Yeah, read them. Everybody read them. Moving forward for the rest of this section and the sections to follow, I did want to note that I'm keeping things accessible in my recommendations.
Okay.
By that I mean things that are in print and fairly easy to find.
Ah.
Because, I guess we should have prefaced, I'm a pretty deep horror collector. I buy things that are pretty rare and nobody's heard of them. And if you want to find a copy, it's like there's one guy in Kansas who's trying to sell it for $300.
Yes.
And you have to talk him down. So I don't want to recommend stuff like that, even though I would, like to. And that's largely what I'm reading and interested in now. I'm reading this fairly notorious horror novel at the moment. It is a book that was only published. It was published twice, once here in America and then in the UK later on that same year in 1977. It's a novel called Eat Them Alive by Pierce Nace, who is an author nobody knows anything about, probably a pseudonym. Some detectives online say that this person was maybe an old woman, which is actually hilarious when you know what the book is about. The book is about a guy named Dyke Mellis, who has been castrated by his buddies and lives on an island. But on the opening pages of the book, this big earthquake happens. And by page 3, he's witnessing all of these giant human-sized praying mantises spill forth from a chasm out into the earth and just devouring people. And, you might imagine your first thought is, I'm going to run away from those things. His first thought is, can I capture one and tame it and then bring it back to America to devour the people who wronged me?
Oh my God.
And, that's exactly how the book goes from there. It's a totally singular book. But, my copy, which is the English edition, cost a shit ton of money that I will not tell you how much I paid for it. So
I like that.
So my goal is to avoid recommending stuff like that's just going to drive you crazy and you can't access, because I want our listeners to experience, the gems of horror fiction that are fairly easily accessible. So with that in mind, I picked a few other classics that are not exactly off the beaten path, but if you're listening to this podcast and you're mostly familiar with horror movies, you might be familiar with these authors, but you might not have actually checked them out because you just don't read a lot. But you should. Reading's great. So first up, M.R. James, the classic English ghost story writer. Are you familiar with M.R. James?
I am indeed.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever read any of his work, or you've just seen the Ghost Stories for Christmas?
I have actually read one or two of his short stories, and then I've seen a ton of the adaptations.
Right. If you're a fan of particularly English television productions, a number of his stories have been adapted by the BBC, particularly in the 70s, although Mark Gatiss of Sherlock and Doctor Who and stuff, he's been adapting some just recently, in the past few years. which have been pretty good. And of course, if you're a fan of the classic Night of the Demon, not our Night of the Demon, but the other one, that is also adapted from an M.R. James story. He's great. He doesn't have a very prodigious output. You can find his collected ghost stories for a song, and it's, I think there's maybe 40 stories in total, fewer actually, but they're almost all classics. He really sort of shaped the Edwardian period of ghost literature, both, over in England, but here in America as well. And if you read these stories and you like them, there is a wealth of ghostly supernatural fiction written by people who are, inspired by or working in the same mode as James that you can get into.
Right.
So much. I mean, so much that was published in periodicals that you still have stories that are being rediscovered and published for the first time since, 1896 today. It's crazy. Awesome. It's crazy. So yeah, James is great. Definitely check him out if you have not. You won't regret it. Other recommendation, one that's probably a little bit more broadly familiar, is, of course, Shirley Jackson. Everybody should read Shirley Jackson.
Yes.
I think most people at one time or another, if you, go to school in America and take like a college or even maybe a high school English class, you might encounter her famous short story, The Lottery. But the thing is, she wrote a lot more than that, and The Lottery is a great story. There's a lot more that's just as good, if not better, and frankly, a lot weirder. She has a whole lot of supernatural stories that I would very much recommend. A lot of the best ones have recently been collected by Penguin Books in this collection called Dark Tales, which if you just want a quick sampling of her supernatural stories, that's a good way to go. Also, the collection The Lottery, it used to be called Demon Lover, but it was retitled because The Lottery was so famous. The Lottery and Other Tales, that one's a great one too. And again, it's a situation where most of the other horror stories, which sometimes they're very subtle horror, they're not in your face. Sometimes you might not even classify them as horror, just like very, very strange, are contained in that book too. And of course, her novels. The Haunting of Hill House, which I think people are generally, even if you hadn't seen either version of The Haunting before, you might be familiar with it now because of the Netflix Mike Flanagan adaptation. Which, even if you've seen that and you liked it a lot, read the book because it's quite different.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, very different. And, I think you appreciate what Flanagan's doing with the material when you're familiar with the original stuff. But that's a really wonderful novel. Other ones that are, sort of horror adjacent, like We Have Always Lived in the Castle,
yes.
The Sundial.
Yes.
Yeah, she's great. Definitely read her deeply. One other person I wanted to highlight who I think is if you like, fiction like Shirley Jackson's that I think is worth checking out, would be Arthur Machen. Are you familiar with him?
I am not. I don't know if I've heard that name before.
Yeah, he's a great one. So there's a number of writers who sort of get lumped into this one category of early 20th century supernatural fiction of a certain type, like Algernon Blackwood,
yes.
William Hope Hodgson. I think they all sort of fall into this broad category of like doing kind of really interesting and different things with supernatural fiction at this point in time. Arthur Machen is one of my favorites of the type because his work is pretty varied. It's also not very long. I mean, I have, his complete supernatural fiction spread out over, 3 fairly slim volumes. But every story is interesting and strange. He's got some pretty famous ones about sort of a very sinister take on like fairy legends. Like the Great God Pan is one that you may have heard the name of before. He has this novel that's composed of a bunch of different short stories with this really creepy frame narrative called The Three Imposters, which I think is very much worth looking into too. A lot of the individual stories in it are pretty well regarded and famous in their own right. So yeah, if you're looking for like if you're looking for like somebody like Lovecraft but a little bit less racist, Arthur Machen's a good one to go for.
You mentioned Algernon Blackwood. I actually very recently remembered that I'd picked up a collection of his supernatural stories for a song on frickin' Used on Amazon. And I dug into his stories, and I had no idea what I was getting into. And at a few points, I had no idea what I was reading. Algernon, that dude is a strange writer. I was not expecting so much cosmic horror.
Oh yeah.
Just like boom, like capital C cosmic horror, man. I was like, this is wild. So I look forward to looking into more of his stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Blackwood's great. So yeah, those are all the classics I chose. Just a little sampling.
Nice. Let's move into the just as important, but not so much classics, as of the horror fiction of the 1970s.
Well, joke's on you, because I chose all classics.
Oh, Schmidt.
Yeah, the 70s is a great era for horror fiction. I mean,
well,
the 70s,
not like literature classics. Like, obviously,
no,
100 years from now, these will all be classics. Considered highbrow literature.
Well, they're already classics in my brain.
Hey, I agree.
This author's work stretched into the 1980s, but I think most of his best work came out in the 1970s. Huge fan of his work. It is totally singular in my eyes. Whenever anybody describes someone's work as being like his, and then I read it and it's nothing like it, I'm like, and that is Robert Aickman, who is just a masterful short story writer. He wrote a handful of novels, which are interesting, but not really, they don't really hold a candle at all to his stories. He described his stories as being, quote, strange stories. He didn't even really call them horror fiction, although they very, very definitely are. They are, like, at their softest, they are bizarre. Very few of them fall under really any conventional understanding of like horror tropes. Like there's this one story that's like a vampire story, and it's pretty clearly a vampire story, and it's pretty unremarkable for that fact. But the rest of them, and he wrote quite a few of these strange stories, are just baffling. I don't think you'll ever read anything quite like them. He is an English writer. He actually, if I'm not mistaken, I'll sound like such an idiot. So he's actually related to, his grandfather is the English horror writer Richard Marsh, who wrote The Beetle, which is a it predates Dracula, I think by like a year or so, but is a great sort of Dracula precursor. And he wrote a bunch of other supernatural fiction as well. Yeah, but he doesn't do it. Robert Aickman doesn't do anything quite like that. Again, his stories are incredibly, incredibly strange. They're deeply like repressed and sadly sexual. Like very little sex is actually happening, but like everything is clearly about sex and aging and dying. And you could have a field day trying to psychoanalyze these. Robert Aickman was apparently he was really into like waterways, like canals and stuff. It is his like real life. And then beyond that, apparently he was like a bit of a monster to people. But he was kind of like a weird guy who just wrote these amazing stories. They're all mostly in print today. I think almost all of them are fairly easy to find. Faber and Faber in England, but they publish in America too. Recently republished some of these really nice looking editions in like the middle of the last decade. Cold Handed Mine, Dark Entries, The Wine Dark Sea, The Unsettled Dust. All of these are, I think, totally essential collections that you should pick up if you want to just be gobsmacked by a story that leaves you like delightfully scratching your head. Have you ever read Robert Aickman? Or no?
I've heard the name. I have not read anything by him.
Interesting. Yeah, he's great. Not much of his work has been adapted. As far as I know, his work has only been adapted for TV.
Maybe that's where I've heard the name.
Well, yeah, none of them in movies, only in like TV shows. One of his stories, a really good story. In fact, it's the lead story in that collection, Cold Hand in Mine. It's called The Swords. It was adapted for The Hunger, the TV series based on the Tony Scott adaptation of the Whitley Strieber book. That was an episode of that. And one of his stories was adapted by actually Mark Gatiss. Mark Gatiss stars in it. Jeremy Dyson, who's another one of the, League of Gentlemen? Is that what they're called? Yes. The person who did he did Ghost Stories as well. Yeah. He directed it. But they did that one back in 2002. And then there were a few of his stories adapted for like in the 80s for some English TV show. And like in England, as they always do, they just like trash stuff after they make them. They just like throw it in the bin. We don't need that anymore. It aired. So they were lost for a long time, but recently they've popped up on YouTube. And you can watch them there, like an adaptation of The Hospice, another one of his really great stories.
Cool.
So worth checking out.
Ooh, with a screenplay by Robert Smith of The Cure.
Of The Cure.
Mm-hmm. He only worked on Fridays, though.
Oh, no, those are his days off.
No. He liked to work his love.
So my second choice here is a man named Ken Greenhall. Now, Ken Greenhall, the two books I'm going to reference are titled Elizabeth from 1976 and Hellhound, a.k.a., as I originally knew it, as Baxter, from, when's that one from? 1977. So those came out in successive years. These are absolutely amazing novels. They are very slim novels. When they were first published, they were actually published under Ken Greenhall's mother's maiden name. So they were originally known as being published by Jessica Hamilton. They were championed by the likes of Will Erickson and Grady Hendrix. So they were recently reprinted by Valancourt Books. I can't believe I made it this far into this podcast before mentioning Valancourt Books. I love them. They are, if you are interested in more contemporary horror fiction, for me, I'm talking about 70s, 80s, 90s. If you're interested in like Victorian and Edwardian horror fiction, if you're interested in gay interest fiction, Valancourt is like where you gotta go. They are absolute superheroes, publishing in beautiful new editions all of these absolute classics. Really the number one suggestion I want you to take away from this podcast is just go to Valancourt Books, look around in their catalog and buy whatever you think looks good, because spoiler, it's very good.
Because they're curating stuff. Like they're really bringing stuff back that should not have been forgotten.
Absolutely. That is like their stated mission, and they do it perfectly. They are really painstaking in both going out and, tracking down the rights for unjustly forgotten books. And in some cases, even going and finding like one of the last copies that exist in a library somewhere of a very old forgotten book and like transcribing it. Wow. They are extremely dedicated and are doing something very important. So they did this for these Ken Greenhall books, and they are amazing. Both of them. I love them both. It's hard for me to pick one. I think that Baxter is maybe a little bit more affecting of a novel in some ways, Hellhound is what it goes under. I prefer Baxter. That's the story of a totally sadistic homicidal dog, but from the dog's POV. So we are in the dog's head as he is planning these murders and developing this relationship with a totally sociopathic little boy, who he becomes the pet of. Totally brilliant. Elizabeth is about a 14-year-old girl who discovers that she can talk to this sort of witch in a mirror, and that she has some sort of witchy powers that are blossoming within her. And she abruptly uses it to destroy her whole lecherous family.
Nice.
So both of these are amazing. They are very quick reads. They are absolutely beautifully written. Both of them are in first person, and again, one of them is from a dog's perspective. And they, I think, nail the first person POV, making them as thorny and as memorable as possible.
Now, Baxter was adapted to a film.
It was a French film that was a fairly popular, I think, art house hit.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's actually being put out on Blu-ray, I think by Kino Lorber, and maybe Scorpion releasing as part of that one.
Cool.
Sometime later this year. It's a good film. It's a pretty good adaptation. I think it's because it's such an sort of interior book, stuck in this dog's head. There's only so much they can do, even with voiceover, which they do. But I think they get pretty close. It's a very, very strong adaptation. All right. So my next ones are not necessarily recommending the full output of the authors, which for Ken Greenhall and Robert Aikman, I would say, go ahead, read anything you can find by them, because it's all good. These next two are just specific novels that I think are great from this period. One of them is a book that is perfect for this chilly time of year. It's by Herman Raucher. It's called Maynard's House. Now, this is a story about a man who inherits a house from an old buddy of his, a Vietnam War buddy who died in Vietnam. And this house is in the middle of nowhere in this tiny town. Oh, this book was actually published in 1980, but you know what? That's basically the 70s, so we're going to say it's 70s.
It was written during the 70s, so
it was written during the 70s. And it's, Vietnam, it's very in the mode of the 1970s. So he goes to this house that he's inherited from his dead buddy. And shit gets wild pretty quick, because it turns out this house is haunted by a sentient witch's hat.
What?
And he gets snowed into this house. Now, it sounds silly, because how could a big floppy witch's hat that's flying around outside be possibly frightening? It's terrifying. That this book takes a somewhat ridiculous premise and makes it absolutely crazy, and weirdly psychological, and ultimately pretty perplexing, is a feat to be admired. This one was out of print for a while, but it recently got a reprint that you can easily find from any bookseller, so I recommend checking it out. Another unconventional sort of haunted house book is one by an author you would not expect. Her name is Anne Rivers Siddons, and she mostly wrote books just about Southern communities. Most of them were light dramas with comedic elements, you can imagine grandma reading one of her books. And then in 1978 she published a book called, and it's totally unique within her bibliography, her very long bibliography, a book called The House Next Door. The House Next Door is a very modern sort of horror novel. It is a haunted house story, but it's unlike anyone you've ever read before, because the haunted house is this ultra modern house that has been built in this fairly, traditional suburban neighborhood.
Okay.
And it's it inverts a lot of our expectations about a haunted house story, and it has a really great narrative device of having the haunting take place through the observations of some nosy neighbors next door who are just watching as occupant after occupant of this house dies in horrific ways. It's both very funny and very disturbing. It's a really great novel, and it makes me wish that, granted, I have not explored Anne River Siddon's works beyond this one, except from just like reading about him. But I wish she maybe, dipped her foot into genre a little bit more, because she kind of nails it with this one.
It sounds incredible.
It's really, really good.
It's like Boarding House.
It's a little bit like Boarding House. It was adapted into a Lifetime movie, which does it a disservice. The book is much better than that. The movie's pretty bad, even by Lifetime standards. But the book, you gotta check it out. It's a great one. All right, so that's it for the 1970s.
Let's take a break there.
Mm-hmm.
The #1 best-selling author R.L. Stine wants to give you lots and lots of goosebumps in 3 different book series. First, Goosebumps, where the terror began and the screams go on forever and ever. Then, give yourself Goosebumps, where you choose from 20 different scary endings. And don't forget, Goosebumps presents books based on the Goosebumps TV show with creepy color photos inside. From Parachute Press and Scholastic, available wherever books are sold. Write us to get information on how to join the all-new Goosebumps fan club. Goosebumps, they're so good, it's scary.
So let's jump into the 80s, the 19ers.
See, actually, you know what? I'm gonna stop you there, because I neglected one from the 1970s.
Rewind.
It's actually a really important one. It's another one novel I'm recommending. And in this case, it's not because, I'm going to besmirch the rest of the bibliography of this author. It's because there is no more bibliography of this author. Not that she just stopped writing. Well, I mean, she did. And it's because she died right after this book. Her first novel was published. She died of cancer, tragically. Which is, both a human tragedy and a tragedy for appreciators of good fiction, because I can't even imagine what her career would have been if she'd published more. This book also was recently republished by Valancourt Books, although used copies are very easy to find as well. It's the novel The Auctioneer by Joan Sampson. This book was published in 1976. 1975, I guess. Right smack dab in the middle of the 1970s. This is a totally harrowing novel where the horror is entirely human. There's no real supernatural. There's some stuff that's like vaguely like diabolical that's going on. But nothing here is outside the realm of human capabilities. And it's about small town turmoil and pressure and violence as this one weirdly slimy, charismatic individual rolls into town and begins basically, through this veneer of civility and charity, begins basically stealing the goods of all of the people in town, forcing them to donate them to these auctions that he's profiting off of, and ultimately using the local police force to intimidate anyone who sort of resists it to giving in. It's a book that Stephen King ripped off pretty horrifically in his book Needful Things.
I was just gonna say, This sounds a little familiar. And Stephen King, as he does, just makes all of the subtle things in this extremely obvious and stupid in his book. But this is an absolutely engrossing and horrific novel. I think all the more horrific because it is, absent of the supernatural. Absolutely something that I think everybody should read.
for the power of it. I think it's a really affecting novel with some important things to say about humans and this weird society we have.
Yeah, Brad read that, and he was telling me it did not restore his faith in humanity.
No, definitely not. You do see the sort of resilient and somewhat dumb courage of this family that tries to stand up to this person, but kind of just standing up by giving in. It's a tough read, but very much recommended. So, putting the 70s to bed. Which we should, because it's sleepy.
Good night.
Let's move on to the 1980s. So I have 4 different things I would like to recommend from this period. Now, this is the period of, this is sort of the boom time for cheap, tawdry horror paperbacks.
Oh, boy, howdy.
Yeah, so when Stephen King sort of blows up in the 70s, the 80s is the result of that. And you have so much horror fiction is produced in this decade. A lot of it from this period in like the very early 90s is, there's a lot of trash, but there's a lot of gems too, including a lot of gems that were published, in some cases like this first case by, originally in mass market paperback, didn't even have hardcover, first editions, but nevertheless are total classics. So my first author who I would recommend, because I would recommend virtually everything he ever wrote, is Michael McDowell. Are you familiar with Michael McDowell?
No.
Okay. So he's another author who very fortunately has been almost totally saved by Valancourt Books. They have published I think they have published all of his horror novels, of which there are quite a few. And he has a few other novels that are really interesting too. Though I think, if you've never read one of his books, you're probably still familiar with him in one sense or another. He wrote the original screenplay for Beetlejuice. It was changed a little bit. It was made more comedic and a little bit less horrifying when Tim Burton directed it. He also worked on an early draft of The Nightmare Before Christmas. But he did a lot of work in particular for television as a screenwriter later on in his career. He wrote episodes of Tales from the Dark Side, Tales from the Crypt. He did one episode of that. Monsters, if you're familiar with that show. He also wrote 2 of the segments from Tales from the Dark Side, the movie.
Okay.
Yeah, so he did a lot of screenwriting work later on in his career. Sadly, later on in his career was also when he was beginning to be ill. He eventually died right before the turn of the millennium from complications having to do with AIDS. He is or was a gay writer. Which sometimes comes out in particular a mystery series he wrote as with another writer as Nathan Aldean. These are really great. This is sort of a subbar to this. They're called the Valentine and Loveless novels, and it's basically like a gay metropolitan Thin Man type books about this gay man and his sort of flighty best friend as they solve all these murders in Boston's gay community. Those are a lot of fun. But it's for his horror novels that he's most well known. Of those, I'll mention a few. His first, which was published right at the very end of the 70s, 1979, The Amulet, is a great one. This is basically like if Final Destination was centered around this weird amulet that's being passed around within this small southern community in Alabama. The death scenes are absolutely crazy, way over the top and ridiculous. But it's also got some really good character work being done in this book in all of his novels, really. I think that the thing to mention most about him is that most of his books you would classify as either sort of Southern Gothic or sort of like historical horror fiction. But it's the Southern Gothic ones that he's best known for. And he has this particularly wry and sort of incisive way of constructing his characters. Particularly, he has a lot of really fascinating female characters that he writes over the course of his novels, including a lot of like matriarchs who are like, very complicated monsters. So The Amulet is a great one for that. I think that one would probably appeal to most readers who like their horror a little bit more over the top, perhaps we might say. Cold Moon Over Babylon, which was published in the next year, 1980, is another great one. This is a really shocking and surprising Southern Gothic horror about sort of ghostly retribution. I will say there are twists in this novel that happen like fairly early that just like leave your jaw on the floor.
Okay, you know what? I have a copy of that.
Of Cold Moon Over Babylon? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've got the original like shiny hologram cover.
Yeah, I just haven't read it.
It's like a foil cover is how I would describe it. Yeah,
so I have actually heard of this dude.
Yeah, it's a great one. I mean, Stephen King, who he obviously collaborated with a bit, he also wrote the screenplay for Thinner, the Stephen King adaptation. Not a great movie, not his best work. But he collaborated with Stephen King quite a bit. Stephen King called him the greatest of horror paperback writers of the 80s. And it's true. If you look at a work of his like The Elementals from 1981, this is sort of like a generational horror novel about like this totally haunted family, and it creates like this sort of like ancestral home in this really unique location that's sort of like set within like these sand dunes. So there's like all this sand that keeps on blowing in through like the various windows. And there's like these ghosts that live in the sand and are haunting the house. That one has some pretty strong Beetlejuice vibes, including from like this main character, one of the main characters who is kind of like a little bit of a Lydia precursor. And then his epic, he sort of did the whole Green Mile thing, a decade or so before Stephen King did, by releasing this one book split up into 6 different volumes that were released, I think, monthly in 1983, or like monthly or every other month. And this is called the Blackwater. The book is titled Blackwater, or the Blackwater Books. And this is an absolutely multi-generational story of this one family, really just this one family, the Caskies in Alabama. After they have a sort of interloper marry into their family, someone who very definitely has supernatural connections, and sort of sends this family over the generations in some very interesting directions. That one is an absolutely beautiful novel. Again, it's very long. If you buy the complete edition of it now, I think it's over 800 pages, but it is so very worth the effort.
I've seen those around. I do not have any of those.
Yeah, definitely recommend it. Yeah, it's not one that you can just pick up any one of the books and read. You really gotta read them all. So Michael McDowell is my top pick for the 80s, but I have a few others for you as well. Another author who's really interesting for a lot of reasons is a woman named Lisa Tuttle. So now Lisa Tuttle wrote a number of novels, a lot of short stories, largely in the realms of horror and science fiction, and I recommend both. I like her work generally. I'm going to recommend in particular, though, this classic collection of stories from her called A Nest of Nightmares. It has this really iconic cover artwork of a bunch of like horrifying chicks in a nest. They are the nightmares in the nest.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, this one was a really sort of hot commodity for a while. Talked up a lot in paperbacks from hell and such. But it did recently receive a reissue in the Paperbacks from Hell reprints from Valancourt Books. So I recommend picking it up there. Her stories are pretty varied. And, she has a lot more stories outside of that collection as well. In fact, Valancourt just put out another collection of her more recent stories because she's still around writing today, although not quite as frequently as she used to. And they're all good. They're very, she has a lot of, but although not to the exclusion, but a lot of female protagonists who I think have really interesting dilemmas that they are presented, oftentimes supernatural. Her work is very, very strong. Definitely recommend checking it out. Another one I'm going to recommend, surprise, surprise, it's another Valancourt Books author. They're actually going to be republishing 3 more of his older novels this year. I've already got copies of them, but what can you do? This is Stephen Gregory. Stephen Gregory writes a lot of avian horror novels, meaning horror novels about birds. It's not the only thing he writes. In fact, he's written some other stuff too. But one of those bird books that I'll mention is called The Cormorant. This is from 1986. This was his debut novel. It is totally riveting. It's a very slim novel. It won't take you long to read it all. It was actually adapted into a film, I believe for television in England, starring Ralph Fiennes, actually, in a pretty young Ralph Fiennes. And it's a pretty good adaptation, especially because of how hard this book would be to adapt, because it's about the absolutely bizarre relationship that forms between this man and this evil cormorant, which is a bird who he sort of takes on as a pet and just makes his life absolute hell. It is it sounds like it would be funny, and it is a little funny at times, but it is also just absolutely disturbing. I also really like his novel, The Wood Witch, which was published 2 years later in 1988. This one does not have bird stuff in it, at least not, prominently. It's actually about a mushroom, in the forest that leads a man to do some really horrific things. Sort of the appeal of this weird mushroom. So yeah, mushroom horror. And what I like about that novel in particular is you hear mushroom horror and, you think about the 1980s and you're like, oh, so is it like mushrooms that start growing on people and consuming them? No, it's just a mushroom that drives a man insane. And
so not Matango.
No, I guess maybe the important thing I'm leaving out is that the mushroom that he's sort of obsessed with looks like a giant dick. So, yeah, as you can imagine, these are quite, again, psychological, psychosexual horror novels. Nice. The last one I will mention is an author who does not have a very large body of work behind him. He did keep writing a little bit beyond this, but it's pretty widely regarded, even by the author himself, that it was all kind of shit. That he only had a few stories in him, but all those stories were really good. And this is the author T.E.D. Klein. Are you familiar with him?
I'm familiar with the name. I don't know if I've read any T.E.D. Klein, though.
Yeah, so he wrote really just a handful of stories that are worth noting. In fact, the bulk of them are collected in this collection from 1985 called Dark Gods. Dark Gods is only 4 stories long, but they're pretty long stories. Each one is basically a novella. And each one of them is a total classic. He wrote another one that's pretty important that was later vastly expanded into his only real novel called The Ceremonies, which was published around the same time. Dark Gods is the one I'm recommending, though. The 4 stories in that are, each one is a classic. They're all very different in their ways, and they're all very, let's say, kind of updating. The best way I would describe them is updating Lovecraft's sort of cosmic sensibilities for the 80s, which, some other people were doing as well, but I feel like T.E.D. Klein does it the best. These are really wonderful, again, I'll use the term engrossing stories that are pretty diverse. There's only 4 of them, but I think they all have their own unique flavor that I would be surprised if you didn't enjoy. Let's say that.
Cool. I'll read that.
Yeah, it's good. So that's it for the 1980s.
Oh man, let's get into the Z Cavaricis.
So the 90s I made much shorter. I just put 3 things on my list for the 90s, but I do think they are all very good ones. So my first selection is someone who for me is very much synonymous with the edginess of 90s horror, because the big difference between the 80s and the 90s is that the 90s, whatever you thought of the 80s and its edginess, the 90s were going to be edgier. They were going to be grungier, darker, extreme. Now, that doesn't necessarily always mean like bloodier or gorier. In fact, I think you can turn back to the 1980s and find a lot of stuff that's more overt. But the 90s were just generally dirtier. Grungy is kind of the idea of the period, right? So the inaugural volume in the Dell Abyss line, Kathy Koja's The Cipher, is my first choice here. I would definitely recommend checking out more from Kathy Koja. She's a really great writer. She wrote a number of novels from this time period, and she's still publishing now. In fact, a short story collection of hers came out fairly recently that's quite good too. But The Cipher is kind of like a good... I think it's very emblematic. It's kind of like a mission statement of what 90s horror was going to be. And this is about some tortured artists, and one tortured artist in particular who finds this weird hole in the ground in sort of an industrial environment that's called, he calls it the fun hole. And, the fun hole does some not fun stuff to his brain and his body. It's kind of a weird psychological body horror. One that's very different from what you'd expect. If you're a fan of like general horror fiction, I think it goes in some different directions than you might expect.
That is very apt, because I read that as a teenager.
Yeah.
And I was, into horror novels as a teenager, and that book, it doesn't come at you in any way you've ever seen before. It was very different.
Definitely. The next person I would recommend is someone who I think works in the same sort of broad aesthetics, maybe a little bit more gothy, but also plays in some more recognizable horror elements, is Poppy Z. Brite.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So Poppy Z. Brite is the moniker of a now trans man named Billy Martin, but still goes by Poppy Z. Brite as sort of like the professional name, because that's the name that everybody knows him by. A number of works from this period, like Lost Souls and... Drawing Blood are 2 really good novels from this period, but I want to mention in particular a short story collection called Wormwood, which I think is kind of essential. These stories from a Poppy Z. Brite cover a lot of like down and out characters, a lot of like, people who are kind of transient, moving around to various locations and encountering bizarre stuff. They have, this sort of... how would you say it? A kind of, I'm lost for words.
I think the word grungy just captures it. Like it's, I'm just talking about Lost Souls.
Sure.
Because that's the only one I've read, but it was very, very memorable for the way that she presented these characters as very real in their tactile, like, weirdness. I'm not trying to put it.
And I think very sympathetic too, which absolutely. I think is kind of a defining feature. Like, I don't really feel much sympathy for the characters in like Kathy Koja's novels, but I do feel them in Brite's novels, which I think is a good feature. After Poppy Z. Brite, the last one I'm going to recommend is to go back to the stuff that I admired at a distance when I was a child, but wasn't really actively reading. I kind of skipped teen horror novels as a whole, because I kind of just moved on to like adult fiction. Voracious readers sometimes I think have that problem where it's like they read kids' books and they're just like, yeah, I'm just going to read Elmore Leonard now. That was my movement, at least. And I'm imagining other people are probably in that boat. So I missed out on reading the works of, although again, I did admire their covers. It's kind of hard not to, the works of Christopher Pike. Christopher Pike,
oh, wow.
He of a number of neon covers with sometimes very direct titles. is a total gem. He is kind of, he was kind of like neck and neck with RL for a while there in the 90s. And his work is definitely the more sophisticated. It is at times, he definitely has, much like R.L. Stine does, a few different things, hobby horses he likes to come back to. Like you better get really used to hearing about sort of angelic, green-eyed, red-haired young sisters if you're reading his novels. You have to get used to a lot of like Middle Eastern mysticism, particularly if you read his later books.
Oh boy,
but
that's awesome.
Yeah, he is nevertheless, I think, in a lot of ways, quite a good writer, at least a very engrossing and compulsively readable author, who did not shy away from pretty mature themes and situations in his books. Like, you read like the Fear Street books from Stine at this time, and Stine and his ghostwriters, they didn't like put a 10-foot pole distance between them and like issues of sex. They put like a football field between them, And if you were an actual teenager, you probably enjoyed reading Christopher Pike's novels a lot more because they did not shy away from that stuff at all. And also, he actually wrote them all. There's not a huge unending number of them. There's still quite a few, but he wrote them all, and they're all very recognizably him. He has a very distinctive voice. One that I'll recommend in particular, I think it's sort of, in a lot of ways, the pinnacle of his work and definitely gives you an idea of, how he was the most authentic teen writer of the time, is one called Whisper of Death, which would make a hell of a movie. It is apparently going to be adapted in this Netflix series that Mike Flanagan is making of the works of Christopher Pike, which is
nice.
Very exciting. He's apparently going to be adapting a bunch of the novels over the course of this series. Whisper of Death is about, it starts with a teen girl who is going to get an abortion, but then it turns into a weird, like possibly post-apocalyptic novel, and then switches to being a witch novel, and in the end ends up being something that maybe gives a very convoluted message about the pros and cons of abortion.
Oh, brother.
It is totally bizarre, very confused, and 100% memorable, which I would say most Christopher Pike books are. They will oftentimes just totally pull the rug out from under you, which is, I think, rare in what is otherwise, if you read a lot of teen horror novels, which I do, they can be pretty formulaic. You're not going to be terribly surprised by what happens. You'll get a lot of laughs along the way, but you won't be surprised. You're reading a Christopher Pike novel, you will almost always be surprised in one way or another. So he's a big recommend for me. Did you read any Christopher Pike novels?
I have not. I have one on my shelves, but I cannot see it from here. I just know the name and I know the covers. I've never read anything by him.
Mm-hmm. So that is it for me for the 1990s.
Nice.
And so I have to turn it over to you to hear what you like and what you read and what you would recommend.
Well, I got into horror fiction with a book called Bunnicula.
Nice.
I believe by James Howe.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the name.
Mm-hmm.
And I read the sequels. I think he wrote them with his wife, maybe? Yeah, Deborah and James Howe. And I read Holiday Inn, which is from 1982, which is very charming, kids' horror book. And I read the sequel, The Celery Stalks at Midnight from 1983.
Yeah.
And I read the third book, Nighty Nightmare, in 1987. And what's really funny is in 1992, he wrote Return to Holiday Inn,
mm-hmm.
which 1992, I was in high school and still reading these, which is cute because they were definitely not,
yes.
They were not growing up with me. They were all like, but I never read past that. They made a few others. And they actually did a made for TV cartoon of Bunnicula. It's really poor quality. So I haven't watched it yet. I can kind of get the gist of how they went with the adaptation. It doesn't seem to have captured the magic of the books. They're very wonderful. I remember reading one, at least in part, out loud to my mom, who's a very patient woman, apparently.
Is the adaptation you're talking about a film, or is it the series?
I don't know if it's a series. I think it was just I thought it was a one-off animated one.
Gotcha. Because there is actually a series from just a few years ago, I think.
Oh my God.
Where, get this, the voice of Bunnicula is Chris Kattan, SNL's own Chris Kattan.
Lord.
The best thing about that is that Bunnicula doesn't really have any lines. Bunnicula just goes like...
Yeah, I was going to say, Bunnicula doesn't talk.
Yeah, so they hired Chris Kattan just to make weird, like, mumbling sounds as a bunny.
So the same year as the book, they did the animated one. And I believe it's on YouTube in varying quality there. But no, I did not even know about the Chris Kattan one. Well, it's on Boomerang, everyone's favorite network.
Boomerang.
Yeah. Being thrown into a very cold swimming pool on a warm day was when I was 11. I stole my parents' copy of Misery by Stephen King and proceeded to read Misery by Stephen King about 11 or 12 times.
Wow. I
don't know why. I just got obsessed with that book, and my parents noticed I was reading it and were like, well, he's reading. I don't even know if they read Misery or not. I just kept reading it over and over again. I loved it so much, as I'd never encountered anything like this. It was so insane. And so, of course, it wasn't long before I got into Stephen King and proceeded to read everything I could get my hands on, up until Insomnia in the mid-90s, which was the book that I was like, why am I reading this guy's shit? I was so irritated with that book. It's probably fine, but it just annoyed me to no end. And so I got out of that. But in the 80s, taking in all that trash, like you were talking about, that wonderful trash, I definitely did not find any of the stuff in this episode so far, other than that cipher, other than the cipher. I was all about Robert R. McCammon. I love, still to this day, love the trashy crap that is Robert R. McCammon. The only ones that I could sit down and read right now, if you put a gun to my head, I would absolutely reread Stinger. If you can find Stinger, it's very fun. That inspired me to write my own version called Attack of the Alien Robot Zombies. And the Night Boat. The Night Boat is excellent. It's a zombie U-boat that shows up, I believe it shows up in Jamaica or somewhere around there, and starts terrorizing people. It's very gory and very fun. Very short, too. You can blast right through that. But yeah, I've read everything I can get my hands on from him. And Wolf's Hour was very important to me as a kid because it had lots of sex in it. So I was like, ooh, this is great.
Isn't that one about like a werewolf who fights Nazis?
Yeah. He knew his audience well. He knew, it was like Werewolf Indiana Jones. The other guy I got into because of my good friend Scott. He was telling me about the Necroscope series by Brian Lumley, and I proceeded to read, I guess, 5 of them. They're so long and so intricate and bonkers. It's about a guy named Harry Keogh who discovers that he can speak to the dead, and he begins to find out there's this conspiracy going on and a man trying to take over the world who's a necromancer. And so he battles with this guy, and it's wild. The whole series is wild. And of course, vampires get brought into it, and there's a whole bunch of sequels. I haven't read any of the sequels. His sons are vampires, and they go on to this vampire realm, and you get all this like crazy. It's like just the only thing I could compare it to would be like Brian Lumley was trying to like do like Dune or something. I don't know what he was doing. It's crazy. He wrote a book called House of Doors, which is a fun romp, a very gory, wild romp where these people, a disparate group of people, find themselves trapped in this interdimensional like place that's like a series of doors. And it takes them all over this, like, it just takes them to other planets, and they have to fight things and get away from traps and crazy creatures, and it's wild. Yeah, he's a strange dude, but very pulpy would be a good word.
Yes. Sounds
for
right.
both of them. Yeah, McCammon and Lumley, very pulpy. John Saul, I read a lot of John Saul. I was in the John Saul fan club for many years. I got more mail. If you took all the mail I got from that and put it in a pile, it would still be bigger than how many John Saul books I read. But the ones I read, I really dug a lot. And of course, I got into H.P. Lovecraft, that old racist.
Yep.
And I really devoured a lot of his stuff. One day I found out that August Derleth had written some of his shit, right?
Well, I mean...
Or just... There was at least one novel I read was probably not written by H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah, I mean, Derleth wrote a lot of Cthulhu mythos stuff that may have been, like, represented as being by H.P. Lovecraft, but yeah, it was not actually.
But I read a ton of Lovecraft. I still enjoy him, even though he was a terrible human being.
Yeah.
What else did I get my grubby little hands on? Shirley Jackson, as you mentioned. I really loved The Sundial. I loved We Have Always Lived in the Castle. Those are perfect things right there. And then I got away from the horror fiction for a long time. I read a lot of literature. I actually said to my friend Scott on the phone, I was like, Scott, can I borrow some of your books? Like, I'm not afraid of big words. I said that unironically, and he proceeded to make fun of me for months. After I said that, it was so funny.
I ain't afraid of big words.
So eventually, got back into shopping for horror novels and tracked down some of those things I've been looking for many years. The aforementioned Lumley books and the McCammons, and then I got Paperbacks from Hell and was just blown away. And I read a few things. Jacob Gustafson very kindly sent me Gila. The Gila friggin' book, which explains to you how to pronounce Gila monster.
It is important.
That book is totally stupid. Every time there's a resting point in the novel, the main lady and the main dude have sex. It's really stupid. Very funny. I can't remember who wrote that book.
Well, see, it's credited to someone named Les Simons.
Yes.
However, that is a pseudonym. The actual author of that book is a woman named Catherine Patasek, who is actually the wife of Charles L. Grant.
Holy shit, she was horny. That's great. So that leads me to Charles L. Grant. The way that Charles L. Grant is described in Paperbacks from Hell is these books that not a lot happens, and they're very moody. And just when you think that something horrific is going to be around the corner, there isn't. It's just wind or a sound coming from a rattling air conditioner. It's always something. It's always misdirection, and he tries to put off the horror as long as he can because he's in love with setting the mood, and he's in love with the characters and everything. So, sure enough, I got into his, because I had no idea who he was, no idea. I've probably read his short stories before, didn't know it was him, and got into his novels, which he's not as famous for. And I got into the Ox Run Dead series, which blew my mind because they were exactly the way they were described. Mm-hmm. I highly recommend if you can track down some Charles L. Grant. Beyond that series, I've read some of his other books, and I've yet to be disappointed. I've had a couple that I didn't love, but everything has been good. And he loves to frustrate the audience. He loves to take you down a road where you don't know what the hell is going to happen. Very unexpected turns in his books. He's very strange, and I need to get his short stories collections.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's most of my... I read... I used to get those 100 great ghost stories and 100 great chilling tales, the ones that Barnes & Noble would put out in the 90s.
Yep.
Because when I was a security guard, I would work from 6 at night till 6 in the morning, and I wanted to scare myself awake because I had trouble staying awake. And I had a lot of those edited by somebody. There was a guy, I want to say Amos was his name. I can't remember. It's been too many years.
The famous Amos.
Yeah. I would follow his different books that he edited because they're always really weird. The stories were all over the place. It was very... he pulled from all these disparate authors and disparate types of stories. There was never anything that repeated ever. Guilty pleasure stuff would be John Skip and Craig Spector. I'm already done with them. I remember loving The Scream as a teenager, and then I read The Bridge, which blew my mind. It was so good. And I read their best one, which is the vampire one.
The Light at the End?
Light at the End is their best. It's so punk and it's so splattery. They should have called it like Splatter Punk or something. But it was really good. But then I read The Cleanup, and it's hideous. Mm-hmm. It's one of the worst books I've ever read for political reasons. It was like one of those. It's like when you're in your 20s and you think The Punisher is cool. Ugh. Or maybe, hopefully, you're not that old. Hopefully, you're a teenager. And then when you're an adult and you're like, wow, the Punisher is really not cool. And I'm talking about the comic book. The movies of the Punisher have been very fun and very silly. Obviously, the TV series of the Punisher tries to make him a bit more realistic. But the Punisher movies are very fun, even though he's, just a murderer. Mm-hmm. They're great. The comics are such a stupid jack-off male fantasy bullshit crap. They're so self-righteous and awful. I can't even. So bad. But yeah, The Cleanup is basically that, and it was offensive, and I don't get easily offended. Yeah, I think that's the main ones. There's a few things I'm forgetting that I remember there was a zombie collection that made me nauseous when I was a kid. It was called Book of the Dead or Book of the Dead 2, and I got it at the grocery store, so it was wildly shocking. It's to this day the nastiest, goriest thing I've ever read. The fact that it was at the grocery store cracks me up.
Interesting.
Let's see. Oh, here we go. There you go. Book of the Dead. Of course, it has a Stephen King. Oh, of course, Stephen King, Robert R. McCammon, Ramsey Campbell right on the cover. So that's why I picked it up. And man, that book is disgusting. I've also read just for funsies, I read the sequel to Night of the Living Dead, that John Russo wrote, The Return of the Living Dead, which has nothing to do with the film Return of the Living Dead. It is so bad. Oh my goodness. It's fun, but it takes the structure of the first one and does it again.
Well, you liked it once, didn't you?
It's so cheesy. It's worth checking out if you're really, really desperate, but don't get your hopes up.
Quit all the complaining. Take it. Eat your slop.
Oh, I am definitely not above that.
I don't know. Is a flesh eater better than flesh eater?
Oh, nothing's better than flesh eater. What are you talking about?
That's what I thought.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you for just doing this whole episode. That was great.
No problem. It's a pleasure. Please, everyone, go out and read some books.
Exactly. Do you have any Stephen King that you go back to? Or that you still remember fondly?
Yeah, I really think fondly back on Sleepwalkers, the screenplay to Sleepwalkers. No, I don't like Stephen King at all. I really love almost everything made from Stephen King's books. I find him to just be an absolutely god-awful writer.
Nice. Well, it's that 7th grade reading level.
Oh boy. All of the folksy repeated phrases in almost every one of not even just his novels where you think maybe he wants to pad it out a little bit, but even in the stories too. Yeah. Take a shot every time college boy is said in a Graveyard Shift. Jesus Christ.
Nice.
You know what? I will say there's one book of his that I didn't find terrible. Mm-hmm. I did read the first 4 Dark Tower books. Yeah. And I didn't like the first 3 all that much, but the 4th one was pretty good. And then I was like, well, better to quit here.
Yeah, it's for the best.
Yeah.
No, I still enjoy Skeleton Crew, and I still have an intention to reread Salem's Lot, because I remember really loving that, and I have a feeling that I'll at least enjoy it again.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he really threw me. I think adaptations of his stuff nowadays are the way to go.
I'm really into, even though I don't like Stephen King, I do like a lot some of the early paperbacks that were published of his work, particularly like the really bold ones that just like didn't even put his name or even sometimes the title of the book on the cover. Like the original publication of Salem's Lot is just like this creepy vampire face with like a trickle of blood that you can barely even see because it's all black.
Yes.
That one's very cool. I have that.
Nice.
There's like this shiny foil version of The Shining that came out right before the movie came out. That's pretty cool. And actually, when you were talking about Misery, that made me remember that I just found out that I think the first paperback release of Misery had a step back cover. I think it was a step back cover. At least that's how it was described to me and what I saw, where if you sort of move the actual cover of Misery back, it has a romance novel cover that's meant to look like the novel that she forces him to write over the course of the book, The Misery Returns or whatever. And it's got the handsome hunk who's like, holding Misery. Has Stephen King's face like drawn on it. Look it up. It's very bizarre.
I did remember, I really loved the one he wrote with Peter Straub, the first one he wrote. The Talisman. That was one I really enjoyed as a kid. And I'm going to be really tacky and give a shout out to a writer, Emma Straub, Peter Straub's daughter. I know her. She's a friend of mine.
Really?
She married one of my good friends, and she was at my wedding. So look at that. I'm famous by proxy.
Oh, that's very cool.
Emma is a very cool person. Her books are incredible. To my knowledge, she has not written a horror novel yet.
Hey.
She's probably like, I don't want to do that.
There's always time.
But she said the funniest thing when I met her. I was like, oh, yeah, Peter Straub. I used to read his books. And she's like, why did you stop? He's still writing them. And I was like, oh, shit. So there you go.
Very
Whew,
cool.
Man, let's call this. So thank you for listening, folks. I hope, thanks to Jeffrey, you have massive lists, and thanks to me, you won't ever trust my opinion on books again. But hey, I was also here. Good night.
Sweet dreams.
Unpleasant nightmares, brother.
Hello, This is the Doom Show is a proud member of the Legion Podcast Network. Please check out the other podcasts on legionpodcasts.com. If you'd like more
Hello, this is the Doom Show,
go to hellodoomshow.podomatic.com.